They mistook your silence for innocence, your patience for passivity, your restraint for irrelevance. What they never understood is that you weren't preparing for the game. They were. You were studying the board, measuring angles, calculating motives, reading micro-expressions like novels. They arrived to impress. You arrived to dissect. They laughed with the nervous energy of children who knew their performance was brittle. You stood still. Let them exhaust their tricks. Let them reveal their strategy through arrogance. And when they thought they had the room wrapped around their grin, you opened your mouth, and everything changed. Because while they were addicted to applause, you were addicted to precision. They played for validation. You moved for blood. They cracked jokes to establish dominance. You listened to expose fragility. They relied on borrowed charisma and second-hand confidence. You leaned on truth. Sharp, ugly, unmoved by performance. You didn't seek their spotlight. You studied its shadows. You knew the most dangerous player is never the loudest one. It's the one who speaks last. Not because they hesitated, but because they calculate. You let them dance. You let them drown in their self-created illusion, and then, with one sentence, one look, one quiet smile, you reminded them that some of us are not here to participate. We are here to correct. Psychologically, they live off assumption. Most do. The human mind prefers shortcuts over depth, labels over nuance. They sized you up by surface metrics, tone, posture, perceived vulnerability. They assumed you were like them, eager to win favor, eager to be liked, eager to prove. But what they didn't expect was the terrifying power of someone who has nothing to prove, someone who does not need their approval to feel whole, someone who can look at their entire game with detached observation and see not strength, but desperation in costume. That's when fear entered the room. Not loud, quiet, subterranean, instinctual. They never imagined you came with surgical insight, that every move they made was teaching you more than they intended. Their humor revealed their insecurity, their defensiveness revealed their wounds, their interruptions revealed their need to matter. They saw the game as a place to win. You saw it as a classroom. They played to dominate the moment. You observed to master the system. You didn't flinch when they got applause. You paid attention to who clapped. You weren't distracted by noise. You were studying ecosystems. And that is a form of intelligence most of them have never even met, let alone understood. You don't fight ego with louder ego. You don't trade shots in public arenas. You wait. Because true intellect knows how to let children play until they reveal the limits of their imagination. And when they do, when the performance crumbles, when the volume fails, when the attention fades, you step forward. You explain things they never knew they didn't understand. Not with cruelty, with clarity. And clarity, to those who've built their entire identity on illusion, is the most violent teacher. They will call it condescension, they will call it arrogance, but it's simply the byproduct of you finally speaking the truth out loud. You didn't come to compete. You came to elevate the standard. And elevation is not a gift, it is an offense to those addicted to average. You weren't trying to embarrass anyone. You were trying to redefine the room. And for people who rely on being the smartest, the funniest, the most admired in shallow waters, your presence felt like drowning. Because you didn't swim faster, you deepened the ocean. They realized too late they were out of breath, not because you attacked, but because you forced them to confront their own lack of depth. They came with quips. You came with data. They came with image. You came with substance. And substance erodes performance faster than fire burns paper. When you started speaking, truly speaking, not to impress but to reveal, they didn't know whether to retreat or retaliate, because they sensed it viscerally. You weren't afraid of their judgment. You were immune to their tactics. You came armored in awareness, and awareness does not lose. It educates by existing. You became the mirror they spent their lives avoiding, not because you shamed them, but because you required them to evolve or exit. This was never about being better. This was about being real. You don't weaponize intelligence to dominate. You use it to liberate. But liberation offends those who have fallen in love with their chains. So they will reject you, smear you, misunderstand you on purpose, because you forced them to question the roles they've rehearsed for years, And nothing feels more threatening to the performative than having to meet someone who doesn't perform at all. You operate from a different layer of the psyche, a deeper code. You do not crave praise. You crave impact. And they can sense that impact will last long after their applause fades. And now the room doesn't feel the same. The stage they once danced on feels unstable. The audience they controlled feels less convinced. You didn't destroy their world, you simply redefined it. You exposed that what they called confidence was mostly just noise, that what they called mastery was mostly just memorization. You made them realize that the person who speaks last can rewrite the entire narrative, if they've been paying attention long enough. You didn't raise your voice, you raised the standard. And in doing so, you became something they will never forget. They ran faster, they laughed louder, they swung wildly, mistaking movement for mastery. You watched them spiral in their desperate search for dominance, fueled by panic, cloaked in charm. They believed effort was power, that showing off stamina, noise, aggression, performance would earn them credibility. But beneath it all, you knew something they could never admit to themselves. Motion without meaning is just chaos in disguise. You didn't outpace them, you outthought them. You weren't louder, you were exact. While they obsessed over appearing powerful, you focused on becoming undeniable. And that difference was the cut that bled through all their illusions. They tried to intimidate you by doubling their energy, as if effort alone could bend outcomes. They failed to grasp that raw exertion only impresses the blind. You didn't blink, because your power was never performative. It came from the place beneath, the place most people are too afraid to explore. Depth, not volume. Strategy, not speed. They played checkers in a game of chess, not realizing that you were never chasing pieces. You were playing with time. You were watching their patterns, not just their plays. You were studying the machine beneath the mask, not the gestures on the surface. And that, to them, felt unfair. But it wasn't unfair. It was earned. And it was devastating. People who fear introspection overcompensate with aggression. They'll accuse you of being cold, distant, superior. But what they really feel is exposed. Because you don't react. You don't flinch. You think. And your thinking becomes a weapon far sharper than their tantrums could ever be. You see through their patterns, their tics, their need to win for the sake of image. They come at you with emotions they can't even name. You respond with questions they don't know how to answer. You don't swing. You study. And what you study, you eventually own. They'll call it manipulation. But the truth? It's just deeper vision meeting shallow minds. You never needed to outwork people trying to impress you. You let them race themselves into exhaustion, watched them set fire to their own credibility while performing control. You let the contradictions surface. You let them reveal who they were through the chaos they created. Because people always show you what they truly believe when they're scrambling to win. And they believe in struggle, in force, in domination. You believe in precision. And when that mindset enters a room, even the loudest noise begins to feel insecure. Because deep down, they sense it. You don't raise your tone. You raise the stakes. Thinking deeper makes people uncomfortable because it collapses their safe narratives. It introduces variables they can't manage. They want to live on autopilot, want to repeat old wins in new costumes. But depth disrupts repetition. It challenges identity. You force people to confront themselves, not because you aim to, just by existing, in contrast to how little they've questioned their own motive. That's the true violence of thinking deeper. It makes those who live for momentum realize they've built no foundation. You didn't push them. You simply revealed that without friction, they've been slipping the entire time. But this is where your real advantage detonates. You don't need to win the moment. You play the long game. You're willing to appear passive, quiet, even disengaged, because your validation isn't tied to public approval. Your reward is internal. A system of pattern recognition, strategy, anticipation. You don't just read moves, you read the psychology behind the move. You don't chase control, you dismantle it in silence. The one who thinks deeper never looks like a threat at first. That's the mistake they all make. They see you sitting still and mistake you for stationary. But your mind is a fortress, and they brought rubber knives to a battlefield of blueprints. You don't measure dominance by how fast you hit. You measure it by how fast they expose themselves trying to hit you. You weaponize pause. You know that silence makes fragile minds echo. You've seen it. The way people unravel when you don't play their game. The way their confidence erodes when you don't validate their theater. That's when they break. When they realize your attention is not something they can buy with volume, that's when the fear sets in. Because nothing is more threatening to someone addicted to applause than a mind that claps for no one and needs none in return. You never demanded they see your worth. You calculated how long it would take before they realized they misjudged you. That's the nature of deeper thought. It's patient, surgical, utterly indifferent to flattery or insult. It doesn't bend to noise. It doesn't collapse under urgency. It waits, quietly tracking every inconsistency, every hidden motive. You don't win through defense. You win through observation, through knowing that intelligence is not reactive, it is predictive. And by the time they think they're in control, you're already 5 moves into a reality they didn't even know existed. You weren't there to participate. You were there to dismantle the arena. People will always mock what they fear. They'll label it antisocial, aloof, detached. But they know, deep down, they know. You didn't fail to play the game. They failed to realize you wrote the damn rules while they were still learning to throw dice. They came to impress the crowd. You came to collapse the theater. They thought faster would win. You proved deeper always does, and now they don't even know how they lost. They just know the room feels colder when you're present, because you're not here for admiration. You're here for evolution, and that makes your presence unforgivable to the performative. You never had to argue. You didn't even have to speak. The room bent differently when you walked in. It wasn't theatrical, it was inevitable. The contrast wasn't loud. It didn't dress itself up in ego. It didn't swing for attention like theirs did, but it lingered in the stillness of your gaze, in the precision of your silence, in the absolute absence of performance. And that was what fractured them. They had curated their status like a storefront, all glass and arrangement, but your very existence, unapologetic, unreadable, unwilling to beg, was a mirror held up to the fragility they dressed as power. They didn't lose control. They were reminded they never had it. They had grown used to winning in shallow rooms, to earning dominance with volume, with charisma unbacked by consequence. They operated like peacocks in a land where feathers passed for strength. And then you walked in. Not feathered, but forged. Not ornamental, but elemental. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't posture. You didn't even acknowledge the theater they were performing in. You just stood there, and in doing so, redefined the hierarchy without announcing it. They realized it before they admitted it. They felt the edge in your calm, the weight in your pause, the power in your refusal to react. And that's when their illusion cracked. They tried to pull you into their rhythm, to provoke you, to box you into their narrative. But every attempt collapsed under the gravity of your presence. You didn't rise to bait. You didn't chase the crown they clutched so tightly. You were the reminder that superiority isn't spoken, it's sensed. That presence isn't performed, it's earned through internal mastery. They wanted to lead the room. You led the atmosphere, and that shook them. Because now, every time they opened their mouth, they questioned if they were being watched, not just by you, but by everyone who had started noticing the discrepancy. That's the cruelty of contrast. It doesn't destroy with noise. It poisons illusion through quiet comparison. You never said you were better. You never had to. They said it for you, in every nervous glance, every failed joke, every shift in posture. Their superiority was never built on substance. It was built on the assumption that no one stronger would show up. And when you did, the air changed, not because you demanded respect, but because you made everyone feel the absence of something real before you walked in. You didn't dominate the conversation. You altered its gravity. You weren't louder. You were undeniable. What unsettled them most wasn't your talent or your intelligence or even your edge. It was your lack of need. You didn't need their spotlight. You didn't crave their approval. You didn't orbit their ego. You were your own sun, your own system, your own gravitational force, and that independence made their superiority look staged, made their confidence look rented. You weren't trying to be the best in the room. You were simply being unalterably yourself. And the more you existed without effort, the more they scrambled to maintain the illusion they had once believed was invincible. They will tell themselves stories about you, that you were arrogant, that you were too intense, that you didn't play well. These stories aren't for others, they're for themselves, because admitting what they felt around you, that sharp contrast between your authenticity and their act, would force a reckoning. It would force them to confront how much of their identity was built on the absence of someone like you, and that you've arrived, there's no going back. They can't unfeel the shift. They can't unsee the hierarchy you revealed without uttering a word. That's the violence of presence. It doesn't beg, it doesn't compete, it doesn't explain itself to people who are addicted to their own echo. It simply arrives, and the room adjusts, the masks tremble, the power dynamics realign. They will call it unfair, they will call you difficult. They will tell others you broke something fragile in this space, but they'll never admit what actually happened. You didn't break anything. They were simply exposed by the clarity you carried in your bones. You didn't make them insecure. You reminded them that their confidence was already borrowed, already cracking, already doomed. You weren't there to be liked. You weren't there to be chosen. You were there because you already chose yourself. And when someone enters a space who doesn't need it, they become immune to every unspoken rule it worships. That kind of immunity is terrifying. It triggers the deepest insecurity in those who survive off perception. Because you make the perception collapse. You force the truth out of hiding. Not by force. Your existence casts shadows. Long ones. And in those shadows, they are forced to meet the self they've spent a lifetime avoiding. You walk in clarity, in intent, in layers so rarely matched that people project their own limits onto your silence just to feel safe. But they're not safe, not when you're around, because they know that no matter how loud they get, how many names they drop, how many games they master, your presence will remain the one thing they can't outshine, outtalk, or outvote. You didn't challenge them. You replaced the game they thought they were winning. And the worst part for them? You did it without playing. They walked in with the arrogance of a seasoned preacher. Chin up, voice rehearsed, smile tight. They thought the room had been waiting for them, that their words were gifts, that their authority was self-fulfilling. But what they didn't realize, what their ego would never allow them to sense, was that their performance wasn't dominating the space. It was being studied. While they performed clarity, you documented contradiction. While they instructed, you analyzed. And while they taught theory, you gathered data on how fragile a man becomes when his confidence is based not on wisdom, but on confirmation. He wasn't educating, he was posturing. And the audience he thought he was enlightening was already grading him. He assumed he was the tallest figure in the room because no one interrupted. But silence didn't always signal respect. Sometimes silence is a scalpel, sharp, focused, waiting for the subject to bleed without aid. You didn't interrupt because you were learning, not from the message, but from the messenger. You observed the micro-neediness behind the certainty, the tremble in hands that only moved when applauded, the dependence on agreement. And in that observation, you realized he had confused dominance with development. He thought teaching was a monologue. You were proof that real teaching is a mirror. And mirrors terrify men who only know how to perform knowledge, not absorb it. They never ask who is listening with clarity. They only ask who is nodding. And when you didn't nod, when your stillness didn't echo the rehearsed rhythm of praise, they noticed. They couldn't name it, but they felt it, the unspoken resistance, the boundary of someone who's been through enough chaos to know that loudness rarely equals depth. You weren't impressed, not because you were rebellious, but because you knew too much. You had learned in pain what they read in theory. You had bled through lessons they skimmed in pages. And while they were explaining life with metaphors, you were watching them reveal just how little they understood the weight of their own words. The man who thinks he is teaching often mistakes the sound of his own voice for progress. But progress has a scent. It smells like discomfort, like inner confrontation, like ego death. And this man, this self-declared expert, reeked of comfort. He was speaking to shield himself from reflection. He called it wisdom, but it was repetition. He called it guidance, but it was mimicry. And while he projected conviction, you could sense the hollowness. He wasn't teaching. He was distracting, hoping no one in the room would hold up a mirror. But you did. With your silence, with your eyes, with your refusal to kneel to the performance. You weren't there to be fed. You were there to watch who served the meal. And whether they had ever tasted the ingredients, you spotted the detachment immediately. You saw how every example, every truth was insulated, protected, sanitized. There was no scar tissue in his teaching, no weathered truth, no uncomfortable edge, just digestible wisdom for obedient minds. But you, the one who had actually suffered, had changed, had fallen and rebuilt. You could feel the gaps, and worse, you could see that he had no idea those gaps existed. Because men like that think speaking absolves them from listening. They confuse output with understanding, and they become teachers who never evolve, just repeat. You're not afraid of teachers, you're afraid of unteachable ones. Men who cling to authority so tightly that they'd rather suffocate than adapt. Men who weaponize their podium because their identity cannot survive scrutiny. You watched him scan the room for validation, not questions. He didn't want to teach. He wanted to dominate without dialogue. But the one thing true students always carry is a knife called discernment, and you held it firmly. You didn't argue. You didn't challenge. You simply didn't absorb. And in that resistance, in that still, unbending refusal to be moved by shallow lessons, you taught him more than any praise ever could. They always assume authority travels one direction, that the one speaking is above and the one listening is beneath. But power has layers, and the most powerful person in the room is not the one on stage, it's the one whose mind remains untouched by performance. He didn't notice when his lesson derailed. He didn't see the audience shift, not because of disagreement, but because they sensed the contrast. You weren't moved, so others began to question why they were. You weren't reactive, so others began to realize how performative their own responses had become. You became the standard, without saying a word. And eventually the teacher will feel it. He will leave the room, with applause still ringing in his ears, but with a chill he cannot explain, a doubt he cannot trace, a silence he cannot ignore. And in that moment, when he revisits the memory of your gaze, your stillness, your unyielding presence, he will finally meet himself. Not the version he likes, not the version they clap for, but the one he avoids in mirrors. And that moment, that sharp inner silence, is when the real teaching begins. Because growth doesn't happen through agreement. It happens through collision. You didn't humiliate him. You didn't try to. You simply refused to play student to a man who hadn't yet passed his own internal examination. And in doing so, you gave him the one lesson no applause ever could. That true teachers never stop learning. That wisdom has no final form. That the best minds reverse the hierarchy the second it becomes rigid. And now, he will either harden or evolve. That's not your concern. You didn't come to take notes. You came to take measure. And what you measured was how quickly even the self-declared authorities crumble in the presence of someone unbothered by their title.